Well, first of all, thank you all very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. This is my first time in Italy, so I've enjoyed myself a great deal. The other thing I want to say off the top is I'm one of those fast-talking Americans, so I'm going to have to try to keep it nice and slow so that the translation can be effective. So my title for this talk is "The Cure is Worse Than the Disease. More Government Means Less Recovery." And what I briefly want to start by doing is kind of giving you an outline of where I want to go in the next 30 minutes or so. I want to really talk about, first, how we got into this mess that we're in, both in the United States and here in Europe. I'm going to argue that it was government that got us in the mess in the first place, which should perhaps make us skeptical about why more government would be the cure. We've also, to some extent, tried more government as the cure, and it hasn't worked very well. We're still in that mess, and arguably here in Europe it's worse than it was a few years ago, at least in some countries. Third, I want to talk about why these arguments for more government stimulus misdiagnose the problem. They make a very fundamental mistake about what the nature of the problem is, and I think the fourth point here gets to that, which is that when we look at market economies, the structure of capital, the way in which the goods that we produce and the goods that we use to produce those goods, those have to fit together like a jigsaw puzzle, right? They are puzzle pieces that have to work together to form a structure, and oftentimes government policies forget that and treat the structure of the economy as something that's much more flexible and more amenable to the kinds of things that government wants to do. I'll say a few words about why government, what the sort of fundamental problems are that governments face in trying to solve these problems and to, as it were, reconstruct that jigsaw puzzle. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about what we might do to solve these problems. So I want to start with just some data, because that's how economists roll. This is the nominal Fed funds rate, which is the rate that the U.S. Federal Reserve targets that banks charge each other on loans. And the one thing I'll point out here is you can see is that this sort of area right here from about 2001 to 2005, that Fed funds rate was in the 2% and below range, as low as 1% for almost a full year. The cost of borrowing in the United States was very, very low. And if we look at the real Fed funds rate, which is the nominal rate minus the rate of inflation, you see something even more interesting, which is this area right here. The real cost of funds in the United States for about a 3-year period was below zero. In other words, people were being paid to borrow. And it's not surprising that we saw a great deal of borrowing take place in the United States. And I should note, this is certainly not unique to the United States. This is the ECB benchmark rate. This is the nominal rate, which again was about 2% for that same period. So this was a worldwide phenomenon we saw the middle and for much of the last decade. And across the globe, what we saw was that central banks had pushed the cost of borrowing artificially low. And the result, there were a couple of different results of that I want to mention. One of which is, again, a lot of borrowing took place. And we often hear stories of the boom and bust of the house, particularly in the United States, of the housing boom and bust, that want to lay the blame on bankers. And we've heard some of that rhetoric, in and out already today. One of the things I'd suggest here is that while certainly bankers made many mistakes, no doubt about that, 2 points to consider. One, those low interest rates that encouraged them to borrow were the result of central bank policies. Bankers were responding to the incentives laid down in front of them by the policies of those central banks. Made even worse in the United States and a few other countries by the artificial encouragement for that money to go into the housing market. And in many ways in the United States, for example, that was done by other kinds of government policy that encouraged banks to loan, and in fact through organizations like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the government-sponsored enterprises, artificially supported that housing market and removed the profit and loss signals that banks were facing. So it's tempting to want to blame bankers, but the analogy I sometimes use here, if we when we leave our discussions today, discovered that there were all kinds of traffic accidents across Milan while we were in here, how would we explain, say, thousands of traffic accidents, assuming that people didn't just somehow forget, how to drive, right? Though driving around the last few days, I'm tempted to say that I could come up with a lot of explanations for drivers in Milan. But the most likely explanation, right, would be that the traffic lights weren't working properly. And specifically, what would happen if all the lights turned green simultaneously? We would see a lot of people making a lot of mistakes, not because people were being irrational. They were just simply responding rationally to a bad signal, to the green. When we see a green light, we assume it's red the other way. If all the lights are stuck on green, people responding rationally will lead to lots of accidents. And I think that's one way of understanding what we saw happen in the last few years. Last decade or two. The other thing I'll point out is that those low interest rates, of course, made it much easier for governments to borrow than they would otherwise. Not all the borrowing mistakes were made by private bankers. Many of them were made by governments who saw an opportunity to expand the kinds of programs they were providing their citizenry and to borrow at a very low cost, made artificially low by those central bank policies. So one way of summing this up is that we saw what we might call severe market distortions as a result of these low interest rate policies. Those low interest rates did not reflect the real willingness to borrow and lend of the public. Rather, they were distorted again by those central banks. The result of this was what Austrian school economists call malinvestment. And malinvestment simply means that with those artificially low rates, too many resources were pushed towards production processes that take a long period of time, right? At low interest rates, we would expect people to want to borrow more and borrow more for projects that would take a longer time. So we saw resources flowing into things like housing or more into research and development, to particular parts of the structure of production. They shouldn't have gone there, and the artificially low rates were the problem. As I've said, often this went into housing depending upon national policies, and if those policies were promoting home ownership. The other part of the story, of course, is that governments, and this is certainly not limited to the last 15 years, arguably perhaps since World War II here in Europe, have been making fiscal promises that they simply could not keep. And this got worse, I think, in the last 15 years. One reason being those low interest rates that we've talked about. A second reason, I think, being the structural problem of in the Eurozone of having countries that had separate fiscal policies but unified monetary policy under the euro. It was simply too easy for countries to run up debts and assume that it would be paid off by someone else through common monetary policy. So that's part of what's a good part of the story, what's got us in trouble in the first place. I want to say a little bit about what we've tried to do. Here's just some basic data on U.S. government spending. You can see certainly the crisis in 08 and 09 caused a large increase, but that increase has continued, and the U.S. government now spends about $1 trillion more than it did pre-crisis. That's an increase of about over 33% in the size of the federal budget. Here's some data on selected Eurozone countries, and you can see most of those countries are spending more now than they were pre-crisis. Greece is a slight exception there, and Ireland being a bigger exception, but certainly other countries are spending more. We can talk a little bit about so-called austerity. I'll say a few words about that at the end, but certainly there has not been a dramatic shrinkage in government spending in most of the European countries. I love this graph because it scares me so much, which is this is U.S. monetary policy, and the previous speaker alluded to some of the liquidity problem. Well, here it is. This is the U.S. monetary base, which is the sort of fundamental measure of what the central bank is doing, and you can see that has skyrocketed to about 3 times now, almost four times what it was at the onset of the financial crisis. And so there is a lot of liquidity out there, and it has not turned into inflation yet, but certainly that's a large fear. So has any of this worked, right? We've created all this money, and we've certainly seen liquidity, though less dramatic here in Europe. Governments have been spending more money. Has any of it worked? The next graph is my single favorite chart that's around these days. This is a U.S. chart, and I want to explain it really briefly. What this dark blue line here is what the Obama administration economists in the early 2009 said the U.S. unemployment rate would be if we passed the stimulus in the winter of 2009. The lighter blue line, it's a little hard to see, that lighter blue line is what they said would happen if we did not pass the stimulus plan. They said, look, if we do nothing, we're going to have unemployment rates as high as about 9%. If we pass the stimulus plan, right, things will be better. Well, the red dots are the actual rate of unemployment in the United States. And you can see that the actual rate of unemployment has been worse than what the administration predicted would happen if we did nothing. At least there are multiple possible explanations for this, but certainly one is that the stimulus spending made matters worse, right? If they were right, if they were right about this, they might have been wrong about this. And again, this is the January 2013 data, the latest unemployment. I think 7.6% came out on Friday. One thing this doesn't tell you, and my understanding is that this has been a problem in Europe as well, is the people dropping out of the labor force. If in the United States there were the same number of people looking for work today that were looking for work in 2007, the unemployment rate would be about 11% in the United States. And what's happened in the U.S. is that people have simply given up looking for work. That doesn't show up in the unemployment rate, but it certainly is a major, when we think about economic problems, that's potentially a major one. Here's Eurozone unemployment. You can see some of the real difficult cases, Spain and Greece up near the top, but they're not the only one, Portugal, and I know the rate here in Italy is now 12%. So we've tried various and sundry policies. We haven't made much progress since 2008, and for most, though not all of these countries, unemployment rates are higher today than they were in 2008. So government was a big part of the problem. We've tried more government. It doesn't seem to have worked. Why not? Well, let me offer a couple of ways of thinking about this. One of those is that when we think about these questions of the role of government and government stimulus programs and so forth, we tend to get overly aggregated. We tend to think too much in the big picture. One of the fundamental ideas in macroeconomics is consumption spending, investment spending, government spending gives us total income. We can put exports and imports if we want in there as well. And what I want to argue is that is overly aggregated. Right now, for one thing, the problem right now in most countries, and certainly in the United States, is not enough spending on investment. The problem is not consumers. And oftentimes in the media, it's portrayed as if only consumers would spend more, the economy would do better. Actually, I don't know the European data, but in the United States, consumption is back up to where it was above where it was prior to the crisis. I believe that's true. I believe it's true in Europe, or many parts of Europe as well. The problem is private sector spending. Private sector investment spending is the real problem here. And the problem I want to point out is that the theory, certainly the idea behind stimulus spending and kind of very basic Keynesian economics, assumes that if the government spends more, that increase in G can simply replace the reduction in private sector investment spending, and total income, GDP, will get back to where it was. The problem with this is that it assumes that government spending is the equivalent of that private sector spending, and it's not. And this is where the Austrian school economists and their view of capital comes in. And remember what capital goods are. Those are the goods we use to produce consumer goods, the inputs into production processes. And what the Austrians argue is that capital goods are heterogeneous. That is, they have a multiple number of uses, but not an infinite number of uses. That any good that you use as an input into production can be used for some number of things, but not used to produce anything. One of my favorite examples of this is when you fly an airplane. Sometimes you'll see the little thing on it that says, seat cushion can be used as flotation device. Right? That's a capital good with multiple uses. You can use it as a seat cushion or as a flotation device. And that's how Austrians think about capital goods. Why is this important? Well, what it means is that when we think about how what an economy has to do to produce wealth, those capital goods have to fit together like puzzle pieces. What they are not is like a lump of clay that we can shape any way that we want to. They're more like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, again, that have to fit together in a particular order, in a particular way. This aggregative view, right, the C plus I plus G view, tends to look at capital as being only clay, as if government spends more money, that's the same thing as private investors spending more money. And it's not, okay? If our goal is to increase GDP, increase that denominator, right? They're not the same thing. They can't just be substituted for each other. We know when we put puzzles together, the pieces have to fit. That is, the kinds of things that we're creating and the kinds of things we're building have to fit together. If they don't fit together, we don't get value. We don't get the economy producing things. So how the particular ways in which resources are spent, the particular kind of spending we see, matters a great deal. So how do we solve the jigsaw puzzle? Okay. One of the things to recognize here is that when we have these inflationary booms set off by central banks being too generous with their credit, okay, we see economies grow, and it looks like they're doing very, very well, okay? It's as if you were building a jigsaw puzzle by using all the pieces, but just sort of, jamming them together and not building an actual picture. You're just making sure you use all the pieces. And that's what happened, I think, last decade as we pulled all these resources into the economy, but they were not building a structure of production, an economy that was ultimately sustainable. And this brings out an important point. When we talk about recessions, oftentimes people talk the recession is a problem, that's the bad thing, and it certainly is. But the reason things go bad in a recession is that they're trying to correct the mistakes that were made during the boom. It's during that period of low interest rates when everything looked good but really wasn't that people were making errors. Okay? So booms are the source of error. What happens during a recession is that we're dismantling, we're eliminating, trying to eliminate those errors. It's like pulling the misplaced pieces apart, right? That's the recession. What recovery is trying to rebuild that puzzle correctly, trying to put the pieces together the right way. And it's important when we do a jigsaw puzzle, right, we have the cover, we're trying to build the picture on the cover. There's a right way to put a jigsaw puzzle together. The goal isn't just to use all the pieces and cram them together in any way you can. And the problem for economies, of course, is that we don't know what that picture looks like, right? We don't have a box that tells us how these pieces are supposed to fit together. That's what markets do. The signals of the marketplace, prices and profits and loss, are what help entrepreneurs figure out whether those pieces fit together and to decide what kind of spending is important and where that spending should be taking place. And that's the key here, right? The point of a jigsaw puzzle is not just to use all the pieces, it's to make something. And therefore the spending that will take place as part of recovery, the growth that will take place as part of recovery, must match the available resources. We actually have to build, create something that's a recognizable pattern that's sustainable. And the problem is that when governments try to substitute for private sector spending, they're notoriously bad at doing this. They're much less able. And I want to say a little bit about why that is. So why does government have so many problems, and why do markets do a better job, though certainly not perfect, at recovery? I think there's two fundamental questions that we have to ask, or two insights we have to recognize. The first question is a question of knowledge. Can political actors, can government agents know what resources they have available to them and how those resources should be used? And notice something here, there's really two parts to this. It's not just a matter of knowing what do consumers want, though that's important. It's also a matter of knowing how best to produce what it is that consumers want. So what do consumers want, and then how do we fit the puzzle pieces of the inputs, the capital together to make the things that consumers want. And there's a long-standing argument by a number of economists that suggests that governments have a very difficult time in figuring this out. And one reason is that they're not guided by profits and prices and so on. When the political process determines how to allocate resources, they don't have to worry about making a profit. They can allocate according to whatever, more or less, criteria they wish to. And without the guidance of the marketplace, government agents have a very difficult time in figuring out what it is that they need to do. Related to that is the fact that oftentimes the incentives facing political actors are not necessarily to serve the public interest. It should come as no shock to say political actors are self-interested. Yeah, they are, okay? They want to get votes, they want to get reelected. And oftentimes that means that the policies they will adopt in order to get reelected might not be the ones that necessarily serve the public interest. And so part of the problem here is whenever we talk about governments stepping in to intervene in economies, we have to ask two questions. Can governments know what it is they need to do? And will the politicians and bureaucrats who we entrust to make those policies have the incentive to do it? And oftentimes the answer to both questions is no, okay? And one of the results of this, I think, is the sort of culture of permanent budget deficits that we've seen since World War II, right? Politicians like to spend money. Once again, no surprise. They don't want to have to raise taxes, right? Spending money gets them votes. Raising taxes tends not to get them votes. Once we say it's government's role to borrow and deficit spend and run up debt in order to help the economy, even if we say that's only supposed to happen during the bad times, and that's what the original Keynesian argument was, government should borrow when economies are in recession, but Keynes also said when the economy is doing well, governments should run a surplus, right, and use the surplus to pay off the debt from the bad times. And so the thinking was, the early Keynesians thought, well, we can balance the budget over the course of the business cycle. But for some reason, and it shouldn't be a surprise, that's never worked, right? Politicians never ran the surpluses. They just ran more and more debt. And that's because there's little incentive for them to do that, for them to cut spending and to raise taxes, okay? That's not a vote getter, except perhaps in times of deep crisis. So we've been stuck since World War II with permanent deficits, even though that's not anything anybody wanted. The flip side of this, of course, is that markets are learning processes. It's not that markets get things perfectly right, but one advantage of the marketplace being the source of economic growth is that in markets, people are able to learn from their mistakes. If you make a mistake and you lose money, you know it right away. There's a signal, your profits are negative, you have an incentive, therefore, to respond to it and figure out a better way of doing things. That's much more difficult for politicians, and it's also a reason why bailouts and other kinds of government help to quote-unquote help to the private sector are so problematic. They cut short that learning process. We end up rewarding people for failure, and we prevent them from both getting the signal and feeling the pain of having made mistakes. Markets are important because not just because they help us get things right, but they tell us when we've got things wrong. And I think that's an important part of understanding why we want to look at the marketplace as our source of recovery. So, my last set of points here. What can we do? And I have we in quotes here. And the reason I have we in quotes is this question gets asked all the time. But oftentimes the assumption is that the we in question is the political class, is what can the government do to solve this problem? And I at least want to end with the suggestion that that's not necessarily the right we. One thing governments can do, however, is to develop consistent, predictable policies. Right? No matter what you think the size of government should be, the worst thing that governments can do is to move back and forth from one policy to another, constantly experimenting and changing path. That uncertainty is what causes private sector investors to say, no, we don't want to invest our resources because we don't know what's going to happen next. This was a big problem in the United States in the Great Depression, for example. I think it's also a problem across the globe right now. Many people with capital, why is all that liquidity sitting in the banks, right? Many people with capital are simply hesitant to invest it because they simply don't know what's going to happen next. And so whatever those policies are, they need to be consistent and predictable. The other thing I would argue is that the size and scope of government are more important than government debt per se. And what I mean by this is that the kinds of regulations or the kind of intervention or the kinds of powers that government has are what we really need to be talking about. And I think the point raised about the numerator and denominator of debt to GDP ratio is absolutely right, okay? And we do need to concentrate on that denominator, on getting GDP up. But it might be the case that reducing the size of government, okay, and reducing government debt in the process is one of the ways that we increase the denominator. That is, shrinking the numerator might help increase the denominator. The other point I want to make here too is that the problem of government debt is a spending problem. Governments have simply, across the globe, have simply spent too much, not just in the last 10 or 15 years, but going much farther back than that. And if we want to be serious about bringing that debt in line and getting recovery going, we need to think very carefully about government spending, which raises the question, what austerity, as we've seen before, we really haven't seen much in the way of shrinkage of government spending in Europe and certainly not in the United States, with a few exceptions, okay? The real austerity, I think, has been at the household level, where people are seeing their purchasing power being eroded, where they're seeing the high unemployment rates are making it more difficult for households to survive. They're the ones where things have gotten more austere, not so much governments. And unless we bring that spending down, we are headed for some kind of, for continued crises of the sort that we're beginning to see in a number of places across Europe and elsewhere. One of the things I think we need to do, and I'm going to leave this as a very general point, I don't have time to go into great detail, is we need to free up labor markets. Unemployment problems are often the result of the inability of workers and firms to negotiate mutually agreeable terms. And sometimes, in many cases, that's because perhaps taxes, income taxes, and other kinds of regulation on employment is simply too high, and employers can't afford to hire more workers. If it's difficult to fire workers, for example, firms are less likely to hire them in the first place, and firms start to look at ways to substitute capital for labor. So one of the things I think both in the United States, but certainly in Europe, as we've seen higher unemployment rates here than in the US, needs to think seriously about is how do we make labor markets more flexible? How do we make it easier for firms to hire and, yes, fire? And how do we make it, how do we encourage more mobility in the labor force so that people can go to where the jobs are? And so finally, who's the we here? The we need not be government, okay? The key to recovery, from my perspective, is that entrepreneurs just need the freedom to act. Entrepreneurial ability, there exists entrepreneurial ability in every country across Europe, the United States, in fact, across the globe. Human beings are amazingly creative and productive and entrepreneurial people. But for that to generate into an increase in GDP, into an increase in that denominator, for that to generate into the real creation of value, that requires that entrepreneurs have a significant scope of freedom to act, to use their judgment and the signals of the marketplace through real competition, profit and losses, to determine what it is that people want to produce and how best to produce it. That's where real job growth comes from. Look, it's very easy for governments to create jobs, okay? Creating jobs is simple. Creating value is really difficult. And I'm going to end with a famous story that's told about Milton Friedman. It's not clear whether this story is actually true or something of a myth, but it's a good story, so I'm going to tell it. Milton Friedman supposedly went to China years and years ago, and he was being shown around by a delegation of Chinese bureaucrats and government officials, and they wanted to show him a new canal that was being built. So they took him out to the site where the canal was being built, and there he saw they were digging this giant canal, and it was people with shovels digging out this canal. And so Friedman said to the Chinese representative, I have to ask you, why aren't you using earth movers or big machinery to dig out this canal? Why do you have men with shovels? And the Chinese delegation said, oh, well, if we used earth movers, if we used the machinery, we'd have many, many fewer jobs. This way we make sure there's plenty of jobs. And Friedman's response was, oh, I understand. Oh, it's a job creation program. I thought you wanted to build a canal. If it's job creation you want, take away their shovels and give them spoons. Okay? So creating jobs is easy, right? Governments can tell us can give people spoons and make them dig holes in the ground and fill it up again. That's not economic growth. Economic growth is creating value, creating the goods and services that consumers want. That has to take place through the marketplace, and right now, government policies in the United States and in Europe are making that recovery more difficult by making it harder for the private sector to use market signals and for entrepreneurs to make these decisions about where resources should be invested. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.